Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Pfeiffer. I'm the social sciences editor at Choice and the editor of LibTech Insights. On behalf of Choice and LibTech Insights, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Empowering Librarians with AI Literacy, a framework for navigating and teaching AI. Today's session is part of LibTech Insights, or LTI, a library technology content vertical from Choice, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. But before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so you don't have to worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use a divider in the middle of the screen to adjust them to your liking. We are using the Q&A function today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We expect a lot of them, and we probably won't have time to get to all of them, so we do apologize for that in advance. But that being said, we will try to get to as many of them as we have time for at the end of the presentation. So please do write up your questions in the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions that you like or would like to have addressed. There is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom panel of your screen. Lastly, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with the recording, as well as a link of where to access today's slides. Before we jump into the presentation, I'd like to tell you a little bit about LTI. LibTech Insights is a content vertical from Choice that examines the day-to-day impact of library and education technology on academic librarians, researchers, and students. The channel provides practical guidance on technology trends and products, including AI and AI literacy, user experience, useful tools, and job profiles. You can find out more about LTI and read the blog via the links in the chats. There is also a QR code to sign up for the newsletter. We send out one email a week with our latest post and some handpicked tech news stories, usually in the realm of AI, so I highly recommend signing up. But all right, with that, I'll hand things over to our speakers today.
Hey, thank you so much, Daniel. All right, hi everyone. I am Amanda Wheatley, and I'm here joined with my colleague Sandy Airview. Sandy, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandy. I'm the head librarian at the Noam Gelber Law Library at McGill.
And I am an associate librarian. I actually have like 3 different job titles right now, so I won't bore you going through all of those, but I'm sure you can imagine how that ends up happening in a library. So before we get started, I thought it'd be nice to give a little background about how Sandy and I got started in libraries in the AI space. So about 7 years ago, I started to consider how AI tools could be used as information seeking tools themselves, specifically with devices like Siri and Alexa and the Google Assistant. And in my research, I found that there was quite a bit happening in AI in libraries, from the back end of things, like in collections, but not as much happening in the front end in public services. And so when I got to McGill in 2018, I met Sandy and we had some great conversations about this, and we came up with a 6-phase research plan where we were going to test out different devices, and we were going to seek librarian perspectives and student perspectives, and we got all of this going. And as we started to work on it, we realized that there was this need for information literacy geared towards artificial intelligence. And so we decided to create a series of workshops for our institution that would tackle AI literacy. And we launched these in 2020, March 2020 to be exact. So I'm sure you can imagine how well those went. But we didn't give up. We kept going. And that's really how we came to be in the AI literacy space. And so today I'm going to take you on our journey through AI literacy, and Sandy's going to show you where we've ended up with our framework. All right. So yeah, as I said, we'll go through AI literacy, we'll go through the research study, the framework, and then we'll take a look at some next steps. So what is AI literacy? Well, we can define this in many different ways, but I think the important thing to understand is that there are a lot of different ways that we're slapping the word literacy all over different concepts, and we're consequently diluting that word quite a bit. We put literacy onto different skill sets as part of marketability around that topic. We've done it with information, finance, data, digital, media, computational, visual literacy, and of course, artificial intelligence literacy. And so we begin to wonder, what is the point of all of these words? If they're just literacy skills, or basically understanding that they're not just literacy skills, they're social imperatives. And the reason that we've decided to do this for artificial intelligence is because the last decade has seen a huge growth in artificial intelligence tools. And that's led to a little bit of digital hysteria and not a lot of common ground on what artificial intelligence literacy really is and what artificial intelligence itself really is. There is a huge kind of umbrella of artificial intelligence, and underneath that are all these different subtypes of technologies that we should be talking about instead, but instead we get bogged up with the conversation about AI or an AI and what it's threatening to do to our jobs, to society, to the little minute details of our everyday lives. So that all becomes part of the noise surrounding AI and the general public. And we really just want to take a step back and look at our responsibility as digital citizens to engage with artificial intelligence, to become part of that conversation, to become part of the discourse. And that's where we get to AI literacy. So some common tropes of literacy, since there are so many different literacy types that are all kind of claiming to be the one and only thing people need to know, we kind of delved through these different literacy types and found 5 common themes or 5 common tropes that emerged throughout them. And so that is to access information, to interpret information, to assess information, to manage information, and to use information. And these frames or competencies can be used in many different ways, but we found that they were common across all the different literacies that we approached. Sorry, I keep going to click my cursor on my thing, not realizing that I have to click on the slides themselves. So apologies if I keep kind of trying to do that throughout the session. All right, so where do we get with AI literacy? I wanted to take a look at one of the early frameworks or early definitions for AI literacy that we've started to see, because there are so many of them out there right now, but there's very few to do with librarians themselves. And so that's part of why we're doing what we're doing. But one of the emerging ones that came out in 2019 was by Turetsky and colleagues, and this was part of a K-12 educational program for interacting with AI. And there were 5 competencies that were developed. And so they're as follows. Computers perceive the world using sensors, which refers to the ability of AI to intake information. Agents maintain models and representations of the world and use them for reasoning, which refers to the training data and regular data that these technologies use to understand concepts and make decisions. Computers can learn from data. This differentiates from AI technologies from others. For instance, that a data set with no AI capabilities is just data for use. And when we add the AI, you have a code that can analyze and learn from that data with or without human assistance. And then finally, we have making agents interact comfortably. Making agents interact comfortably with humans is a substantial challenge for artificial intelligence developers. This speaks to both the scientific issue with coding and a social issue with ethics. And then, finally, now we have AI applications can impact society in both positive and negative ways, which opens up the discourse for conversation. Now, these 5 competencies are a great starting point, but they also leave out an important aspect of being literate, which is the use of the skill itself. So where do we go from here? This brings us to the next major mention of AI literacy, which was also by researchers in education. So this is Long and McGregor's 2020 AI literacy competencies. And so they define literacy as a set of competencies that enables individuals to critically evaluate AI technologies, communicate and collaborate effectively with AI, and use AI as a tool online, at home, and in the workplace. And their conceptual framework includes 5 overarching general themes with 17 specific competencies and 15 design considerations. But again, this was for use in education, so it wasn't totally applicable to what we were seeing in libraries. But I want to go over those 5 general themes just really quickly here. So the 5 themes of Long and McGurko are: what is AI? What can AI do? How does AI work? How should AI be used? And how do people perceive AI? These 5 themes align more closely with other literacy concepts than the previous proposed framework, but also lacks a significant theme for higher education, which is: how should I use AI responsibly? There are many other spaces like TikTok, Twitter, and Reddit that will list apps or software for students where they can kind of get recommended articles or papers that they can use for their assignments. We know that ChatGPT is doing this as well. And later in our session, we're going to talk about more about how we can kind of address these things, and in our framework, how these are addressed. All right, so Sandy and I have been working on AI literacy for a while. So we've gone through a couple different attempts at arriving at a framework. And so the first attempt, we really wanted to see those 5 common tropes of literacies and how they could interact with artificial intelligence. And so we wanted to look at accessing existing frames and other accessing existing AI frameworks and other literacy frames. We wanted to look at interpreting what skills and competencies are needed at the higher education level, assessing the validity and usefulness of skills for providing AI literacy training, managing by storing, promoting, and reevaluating competencies, and use in instruction, consultation, and internal development. So this is really where we started from when we began work on our AI literacy workshops. We were keeping these kind of common traits in mind as we progressed. And so we started to build a little bit of a framework from here. And this was in the first iteration of the workshops. And then we have the second attempt at the workshop, which included a lot more experimentation and engagement. And we use this framework in our AI literacy series as a good way to ground the workshops. And so even though it touched on all the 5 common literacy tropes, it tended to jump around a little bit with the different skills needed and didn't have a logical sequence for learning. So this second attempt at a framework begins with being AI literate, requires a commitment to keeping up with current advancements and policies, critically evaluates and participates in discourse on these technologies, not to just read about AI, but to experiment with new technologies and become an active agent, find ways to integrate these technologies into your research and workflows, and constantly evaluate and interrogate AI, reviewing its position in your life and research. And so this was what really became the cornerstone of our AI literacy workshops, and kind of what we wanted to make sure was being taken away throughout the series of what we were doing. But that needed to be further developed as well. And so as we worked on that, we really decided that there should be a logical sequence of events. So we found that we had all these great ideas for frames, but we weren't quite sure on how to build on that to make it more hierarchical. And so in order to do that, we started to establish a base of conceptual understandings that would be used for AI, and establish how they would fit into our framework. And so 4 common themes emerged from here. So terminology, opinion, bias and ethics, and application. So terminology is demonstrating an understanding of what AI is and the different terminology related to it. For example, this could be machine learning algorithms, a theoretical theory of applied AI. Opinions could be developed opinions of AI technologies, questioning points of view that are only positive or negative with regards to AI. Bias and ethics could be recognizing the ethical considerations related to AI and the biases that can occur in an AI system, for example, face recognition and privacy issues. and the applications of AI, which identify AI technologies to implement in daily life or research, and to describe the potential benefits and challenges of using these technologies. So these were kind of the 4 conceptual understandings that we wanted to move forward with as we proposed a new framework. And from here, we started to look into what would be a model of a hierarchical framework. So something where there was sequential learning. And this brought us to Bloom's taxonomy, which is a learning model in the field of education. It's a hierarchy of domains that an individual needs in order to become literate in a subject. And so that really resonated with us. And so if you're not familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, I'm just going to go over the 6 kind of frames or themes of the taxonomy, which are to remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And so in order for the learner to progress, you must start at the base of remember and then build your way up through understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. So you would do each one in order and progress to each step, as opposed to something like the ACRL framework for information literacy, which is modular and can be applied in any order. So if you're not familiar with the ACRL framework, it incorporates threshold concepts, which are foundational concepts that once grasped by the learner create new perspectives and ways of understanding a discipline or challenging a knowledge domain. So learning is not done sequentially, and no single frame relies on the other in order for the learner to grasp concepts. So we wanted to kind of honor a little bit of what was happening with the ACRL information literacy framework with our own AI framework. And Sandy's going to talk a little bit more about the results of our study that kind of lend itself to that. But really what we wanted to do was kind of take the spirit of the ACRL framework and the spirit of Bloom's taxonomy and see how we could build something out of that. And so we mapped the 2 of them together. And so we kind of created this step where remember was information creation as a process, understand was research as inquiry, apply was searching as strategic exploration, analyze is information has value, evaluate is authority is constructed and contextual, and create is scholarship as a conversation. And so from here, we really started to get into what then would be the AI literacy frames. So we wanted something that, again, honored the ACRL framework, but also works sequentially in a hierarchical model like Bloom's taxonomy. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sandy now to talk about the research study and the framework that kind of developed out of that.
Great, thank you, Amanda. So to give you a bit of context on how we came to do this, so we'd already been kind of wrestling with building our own AI framework, and then Choice, the LTI blog, very kindly reached out to us and, asked if we would be interested in collaborating some content. And we wrote like a short piece on AI literacy, and they came back asking, would you like to do a bigger publication on this and do a white paper? So this is how we were able to do kind of a bigger research project. So thank you to Choice for their support in this. We're very happy with how it turned out. So we'd been thinking about these processes for a while. We'd had our own experience teaching them, teaching students about AI, teaching people about AI, but we kind of wanted to go hear from other librarians. Like, what were their experiences teaching AI, whether by itself or as part of other types of instruction, and kind of what were the kinds of questions that they had, what were they teaching, to help us kind of build a really robust framework that could be used not just by us, but by other people. So in order to do this, we conducted 15 semi-structured interviews. We received research ethics board approval. So we had ethics approval to do this with humans. We conducted them on Teams because that's what's approved by our institution, our instance of Teams to do research interviews. They lasted about 30 minutes on average. We recruited people mostly on listserv, or if we'd seen any conference presentations on the topic of AI literacy. We then used Microsoft transcription to capture the interviews, just because that way it kind of helped us skip a step, like we didn't have to deal with recordings and then transcribing them. Microsoft Word did a somewhat good job doing that for us. We had a little bit of cleanup to do, but it definitely saved us some time. Then we imported all of the transcripts into Excel, and we manually coded the transcripts, really looking at what were the emerging themes that were coming out of those interviews and those conversations. We could have used something like in Vivo to do this, but given that we just had 15, it didn't seem to make much sense for us to just like learn how to use in Vivo. It would have taken pretty much as much time. And we decided pretty early that some of the answers, well, any of the answers could be assigned more than one code. And that's because of the nature of the questions we were asking people. Very often they didn't just answer the question, they would kind of add on to it, which was great, really good data for us. But we wanted to make sure that we captured all of that in the analysis. So here are some of the research, some of the interview questions that we asked people. So does your library provide information literacy instruction outside of course affiliated teaching? So kind of like in the library, not in a class. If so, describe what sessions are offered and how frequently. Does your library provide instruction on the topic of artificial intelligence, where AI is the kind of the main topic covered? Please describe how artificial intelligence is addressed in your instruction. So list the learning objectives, and that was particularly helpful to us, as you'll see in the results in a moment. Does your library incorporate any existing literacy frameworks, such as the ESRL framework for information literacy, into your AI instruction? Does your library provide any services or programs on the topic of artificial intelligence, where AI is the primary focus? So when we talk about services and programs here, we mean not instruction. More like, do you have like a lab, for example, or you know, events centered around that? And then we had, does your library have a policy or guidelines for librarians providing instruction on AI? Do you or your colleagues include AI as part of in-class instruction? Or has it come up as a discussion topic from students? Does your institution have a policy or guidelines for faculty and staff, including artificial intelligence in their teaching? And does your library provide training or professional development opportunities for those interested in learning more about AI? So those questions really helped us kind of tease out some things that helped us build the latest iteration of the framework. So we were really interested in this particular one, where people told us the AI topics that are covered in their instruction. So more than just broadly, you talk about AI or you talk about ChatGPT, what are some of the other things that are coming up? So obviously, ChatGPT and generative AI has been kind of everywhere in the last year and a half. So that's come up quite a bit, but also other really interesting concepts like the ethics around it. Copyright, intellectual property were really popular topics, staff training, and a little bit last, but still represented, were machine learning, prompt engineering, like how to write good prompts, and algorithmic bias. So those were kind of the main topics that we found were covered in instruction. And then we asked them, what are some AI-related skills that people were using to create learning objectives? And I found that particularly interesting, like asking people what were some of their learning objectives. And again, we see similar to the topics, but slightly different in representation. So obviously a lot of ChatGPT, but a lot of just basic AI knowledge. So understanding terminology, like when Amanda was talking about having that kind of big AI umbrella and all those different subtypes of AI, this is where this would fit in. So that came up quite a bit in terms of learning objectives, the ethics, the prompt engineering, and then we have like the more critical thinking side. So critical thinking, looking at the accuracy of the content, and then attributing it. So how do we cite AI? And then a little bit less represented, but still important. We're also like, where does it stand in the search process? And what is its place in legal research, which I found very interesting as the head of law library. And then we asked people if they were using the framework to teach AI, what were some of the frames that were coming out as most relevant to teach about this topic? And a lot of it was authority is constructed and contextual, which I think is one of my personal favorites. But it came up a lot in the context of AI. Scholarship as conversation, which I found really interesting, but meant that people were really concerned about where does it stand in this kind of information ecosystem of scholarship. Information as value. So I think we can all think why that would be important and why that would come up, right? Like the value of the information, and is it accurate? Does it have value if it comes from ChatGPT? So on and so forth. That came up a lot. Information creation as a process and searching and strategic exploration were also represented, somewhat less. And it was also interesting to note that research as inquiry was not mentioned. So not so much a concern, it seemed, for librarians in terms of AI. All right. So all of this wonderful information helped us kind of further narrow down some of the topics and concepts that Amanda mentioned to really kind of bring the framework to somewhere that it could be useful to us and to other people. So what we ended up conceiving, our third attempt, is, as Amanda mentioned, kind of a staggered approach. So you have to progress through different levels. And we decided to pick something like this just because for AI, in order to have a lot of the more advanced conversations, you kind of need to just have a basic understanding of it, right? It's not as modular as other topics might be. So we started with knowing the basic principles of AI, then understanding the fundamental differences of AI types. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next slides as to what that actually entails and what some of the differences are between those two. Experimenting with AI tools, reviewing the outputs and outcomes of AI tools, evaluating the impact of AI on a societal scale, and engaging with the AI discourse. So a little bit like, taking some of the work that Long and McGurko had started, but really bringing it up to a bit more for higher education. All right, so knowing the basic principles of AI, this is where you want to establish that base knowledge of artificial intelligence, including reviewing definitions and understanding terminology. So for example, when Amanda was talking about that big umbrella of AI and all the different terms like neural networks or deep learning or natural language processing, like what do those mean and where do they, what are some of the definitions related to those? And we've also put some example learning objectives to kind of help you conceive of how you would put that maybe in practice. So for example, recall the definitions for artificial intelligence, machine learning, and generative AI. Recognize the difference between narrow and general in AI and how much human intervention is required in each. So is there a person approving the output? Then we have understand the fundamental differences of AI types. So this is where we want to really understand how those different AI technologies kind of branch off into different subsets and where those fit. And understand which tools might result from like the application of which AI type, right? So for example, express how artificial intelligence includes many subcategories and how they relate to each other. And summarize which subtypes of AI are used in certain tools. So for example, if you have something like ChatGPT that uses like natural language processing to understand what we're asking it, that's an example of that particular learning objective. All right. Okay. And our third frame was experiment with AI tools, because we do think it's important for people to kind of get out there and test them out. So user must elect to participate with AI from a learner standpoint, so wanting to learn more about these tools, and must engage with AI tools with the purpose of expanding their knowledge, right? So for example, experiment with the different AI tools that are available to you, implement effective strategies to create prompts for generative AI tools. This is where we chose to put the prompt learning objective, which came up quite a bit when we were having discussions. So we felt like it had to kind of be represented within one of the frames. Again, keeping in mind that generative AI may change in the future. That's why we didn't put it in kind of the description of the frame, but rather put it as an example of a learning objective. Okay, so review the outputs and outcomes of AI tools. This is where our authority is constructed and contextual kind of comes in. So analyze and critique the products of AI tools and determine the worth of these results. So for example, appraise the quality of the output created by an AI tool and question if it's appropriate for your purposes, right? Which I think students frequently struggle with, right? Knowing that you can use ChatGPT, maybe not to write your paper. Maybe you can use it for something else, right? So that, appropriate use is also very important. Distinguish content created by humans and artificial intelligence, right? A bit of that Turing test to figure out which is which. And then we have evaluate the impact of AI on a societal level. So participate in large level discussions on the impact of AI in the broader society. So, if you have any concerns about ethics, for example, those discussions would take place kind of at the level of this frames. So I know there's a lot of concerns about the environment or the kind of labor that goes into this. So again, you would need kind of the previous knowledge to be able to have articulate discussions on this. So for example, comment on the impact AI can have on the environment, and critique the bias that can be present in artificial intelligence and algorithms, right? So broader issues as well. So ethics, bias, the environment. This is where we've kind of put those very, very important discussions that are happening more and more around AI. And finally, engaging with the AI discourse. So we really want people to kind of stay involved with the conversation by engaging with AI literature, discussion groups, just kind of it's a bit challenging to keep on top of the information because I feel like every week there's 50 new tools coming out, but kind of making an active effort to be aware of what's going on and engage in those conversations and not be afraid to talk about it, and maybe have a group of friends and set up your own little journal club where you can talk about AI or test different tools out, for example. So learning objectives would be plan ways to stay active in artificial intelligence conversations, collaborate with other learners to keep up to date on AI developments. Like I said, do you create conversation group, a journal club, a shared Zotero library where you can share like interesting articles that you find. So really kind of staying part of that discourse so that people stay engaged with it and what is happening. So that's kind of what we came up with, and we'd love to kind of hear from you as well and hear your questions. But some of our next steps, so as Amanda mentioned, we had a really great 6-step research plan, and then about midway through the pandemic happened, and we were just at the stage where we would have actually surveyed students or tried to get information from students about AI. So it was not quite the right timing for that, but now that we're back in person at the university, and there's a bit less survey fatigue, we plan to do a survey of our students at McGill on their perception and uses of artificial intelligence. So really seeing what are they using it for. And I think we'll have very interesting results now, much more than we would have had 4 or 5 years ago, especially with, generative AI tools. It'll be really interesting to see if that has, had an impact on how students conceive of artificial intelligence and also how they use it in class. All right. So thank you. I think we went through things quite quickly, but then we have more time for questions. So if you have any questions, I think Danielle's going to moderate the Q&A for us.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much. So we'll be moving into the Q&A. Before we do, I just want to quickly mention for those of you who dropped in late or have to leave early that, again, we will be sending out the full recording of this presentation as well as the Q&A and the slides. If you want to keep up to date with LibTech Insights, including our blog posts and our upcoming webinars on AI and other topics, please do subscribe to our newsletter. It takes, again, just about 20 seconds, and I'll drop the link in the chat. But all right, let's get started with the Q&A. The first one comes from Natalie. Kind of a fun question. Have you tried to use any AI tools to generate a framework itself, or to get AI to do it itself?
So not before. I can say that during the work, we did not ask ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini or anything like that. Since then, I've done it just as like a, what does it do kind of thing. So actually, when I saw that question, I went and pulled up my ChatGPT history. And I found my conversation, and it was really just basic. It was understanding AI, critically evaluating ethical considerations, and then practical applications. And that was kind of what it came up with. And the context that I used there was creating a framework for librarians as well. So it was very similar to what we were doing. So it had some similarity, but lacked some of that discourse that we tend to get with other frameworks when we're in libraries. So it was interesting to see.
Yeah, and I think we didn't want to really ask it that while we were doing the project because we didn't want to get kind of influenced by it. I'm not sure if I want ChatGPT to be a co-author on our AI framework, but it's interesting to see how it thinks of the literacy for itself a little bit.
All right. This question is from Jules. It might be that I just don't understand the scale that you used for your graphs, but it's curious that you conducted 15 interviews and ChatGPT only came up for 4 interviewees, and the research as inquiry frame didn't come up for anyone. Can you talk more about the context of who you spoke with and perhaps the scale of your visualizations?
Yeah, sure. So we spoke to librarians, academic librarians in universities. We had participants from Canada, but also from the US. So we tried to have like a sample that was manageable, but also, kind of diverse enough in a way, included a lot of different places. Sometimes while you see, the reason why it doesn't necessarily come up to 15 is that sometimes people mention more than one thing. As we said, like we applied more than one code just because the interviews were so rich, we wanted to capture everything. And actually a lot of the people we spoke to were not using the ACRL framework to teach AI. So that's why some of the frames came up not that much, but look, so much bigger, even if it's just 4, because a lot of our interviewees didn't actually use the framework to conceive of their AI sessions, which we thought was interesting given kind of the work that we were engaging in.
Right. I have 2 questions that are a little bit more like pedagogical focused. The first one is going to be coming from Jody. Thank you, this is a helpful framework, but I'm curious, if your time to teach this was limited, what would you prioritize based on your research?
So I think Sandy and I tend to prioritize that foundational level of artificial intelligence. So in all the workshops that we do, we actually start with that. So even if you're attending something that's, a little bit more in-depth about research tools or it's about ethics, We start with just the basic foundations of artificial intelligence because it gets everybody on the same page. It lets people know that we're talking about multiple tools and not just AI as a singular concept. And it kind of opens the door for more curiosity and exploration. So really setting a grounded foundational knowledge with everyone I found is really important. And then if you're limited on time, kind of picking the frames that speak to the workshop that you are putting on can be really helpful. Sandy, I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, so that's a really good point that Amanda's bringing up. So we always try to make sure that everyone has kind of the same base level of knowledge, because we'll give sessions, and it varies from year to year. Like, well, I do a Chat GPT for your law degree. Last year, no one was using Chat GPT. This year, they all are. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily understand the terminology. Like, I see people using generative AI and LLM like interchangeably, and I'm like, that's not the same thing. So it makes it difficult to have more advanced conversations if you don't grasp that basic knowledge. So we try to get them that basic knowledge, and then if I can, like, get them thinking about, that appropriate use. Because really that's what we're seeing a lot of in academia, at least in my faculty. So like getting them curious about some of the higher up frames, so that then if they want to know more or explore more, they at least have the basis so that they can kind of continue to reach that or continue to come to other library workshops about it. So that's kind of what we try to do.
All right, so this is the other pedagogical question one from Evangeline. How do you envision this framework being applied? Do you imagine this would be possible in a one-shot or a workshop? Do you imagine a train the teacher approach?
Yeah, so I think for Sandy and I, we had to split most of this into 3 different workshops. So applying it in a one shot can be a little bit difficult. So sometimes you kind of have to pick and choose how you're going to kind of do that. But we have really kind of spread it out over 3 workshops. And that's the approach that we've taken, and it's worked really well for us. Each of those workshops is about an hour and a half long. So they're not too taxing for people to attend. We usually do them over the lunch hour. Yeah, that's been our approach, is to spread them out over 3 sessions.
Yeah, and for your point of to train the teacher essentially, or train the expert. So we've been teaching those with like a focus kind of on students mostly, although we have been getting invited to say like postdoc research groups and some faculty sessions as well. But what we're trying to do in the library is that now we have a working group that we're the co-chairs of. So we're gonna slowly start to build kind of loosely using that framework, the competencies of our colleagues, so that first everyone's kind of comfortable in the library talking about AI and isn't too, hopefully too afraid of it. And then, with the culmination of maybe starting some kind of interest group so that people can reach that upper level of maintaining and staying involved in the conversation. So yeah, it kind of depends on the amount of time you have and the delivery method available to you. But as Amanda said, it might be a lot. Like if you have 15 minutes in a class, which as we know sometimes happen, might not, you won't be able to go through all of them. You might just be able to hit the first one and then kind of spark that interest for the other ones as well.
All right, we'll get into a couple questions about the frames. The first one we'll do from Helene. Can you talk a little bit more about the work you did when comparing Bloom's taxonomy and the ACRL framework? Interesting how they matched up so well.
Yeah, so really we were looking into what kind of work could be applied, and Bloom's taxonomy really spoke to us because of that hierarchical nature, as I mentioned. And as I was looking at Bloom's taxonomy and I was looking at the ACRL framework, I started to see patterns emerge between them, which is interesting because one is sequential and one is modular. So the fact that they line up so well was, I think, a little bit more just chance, that they kind of came in like that. So it was really just kind of taking an in-depth look at both of them and seeing where they lined up together and then where that might be beneficial for us going forward.
All right. Here's a question from John. There was a lot of conversation when the ACRL framework was made to specifically not make a skill/competency-based framework. Did you include critical information literacy in the process of developing your literacy framework, where these critical perspectives can be found?
That's a good question. And I have to say, like, I'm a big fan of the framework personally. The reason why we created, a specific AI one is that we found that in some places it missed maybe a little bit of specificity to deal with AI. And because, like we said, it's really difficult to kind of have that base. If you don't have that basic understanding of what an LLM is versus a Gen AI, it becomes really difficult to have like those more advanced conversations about it. So we didn't specifically look at like kind of that side of the framework that you mentioned. We more conceived of it as like kind of a ladder for that specific reason to address AI specifically, because it worked for that topic, is what I would say. Does that answer the question? Hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's good. We have two questions that are kind of more ethical focused. This first one comes from Aisha. Why did you choose to have societal impact as a later outcome? Specifically, any reason why this wasn't integrated at each step as a continuous outcome, also as a way to waylay ethical fears from faculty?
Yeah, I think part of that is that inherently it is kind of included in everything. The objectives are really looking at those stages, but we wanted to have something where it was its own separate frame, its own separate consideration, to make sure that it wasn't being ignored outright, that you could apply it. You could apply these kind of societal, ethical kind of conversations to each frame. But then also recognizing that these conversations can happen separately, and kind of need their own space as well. So we wanted to make sure that there was room for that space.
Yeah, and as Amanda said, we really wanted to make sure that it stood out as an important topic, because we were afraid that if we include it as just like an example of a learning objective, it could kind of easily kind of, not maybe get as much attention. But it is, as much as it is a ladder, right? Or we conceived of it as a kind of step by step, some of them do kind of bleed into each other, right? Like when we talk about, evaluating the output, we do talk about bias, right? Because it is something that's going to influence your output, right? So it is something that wanted to have its own thing, so it has attention to it, but we do consistently talk about it just by the nature of what an AI tool is and the training data behind it.
All right. This is another ethical question from Ali. It's really not possible to tell the difference between AI and human-generated materials with any kind of accuracy. People who think that they can often accuse students who are writing their own materials instead of using AI, or people who think they can often accuse students who are writing their own materials of using AI and are likely to be biased against certain groups like English language learners or neurodivergent students. Why'd you include this in your literacy framework?
That's a good question. And yes, there are definitely, you could look at something that ChatGPT produced and something that, someone whose English is not the first language had produced, and they could seem very similar. But I would argue that it isn't the same, because like ChatGPT, a tool like ChatGPT tends to be very verbose and use very big words, and just like add on a lot of text, which may not necessarily be the something we see all the time for those groups. But I think where we see it the most is image generation. Have you ever seen those kind of like people with like 6 or 7 fingers, or those fake Pixar posters? I think it is becoming more and more challenging to tell. I think it's particularly challenging when people use detector tools, and that's when we see a lot of kind of false accusation of students because they are not accurate because they use the same technology as the Gen AI, so they're hallucinating that you're using Gen AI most of the time. But you're right, in some cases it's becoming increasingly difficult to tell. So we do have to be kind of careful about that. But in other uses, it's very clear and blatant. So for now, we still include it, but that, in a few months, that might be completely different, right? I don't know if Amanda wanted to add anything or.
Yeah, no, I think that covers it really well. And this is something that in the frame to review outputs and outcomes of AI tools, we can really kind of take a look at like a deeper dive into the content being created by Gen AI versus a human, and kind of see where they compare and contrast to each other. And so it's all part of the work.
And we do talk a lot about that, be careful before you say this is Gen AI, because it, is not an accurate way to evaluate language.
Right. This question kind of gets us back into the question of using AI that you were getting at, Sandy. So this is from Paul. Can you please provide some examples of specific AI tools that you are teaching and different AI types? And what sort of experiments are being assigned with AI?
Yeah.
Oh no, go ahead, Sandy.
No, I mean, go ahead and I'll wrap up with some law examples.
Okay. So in our AI and research workshop, we talk a lot about literature review tools, just because especially that we've noticed that people are starting to use ChatGPT to generate lit reviews for them. So for us, it's really important that they realize that if they want to use something AI powered, that there are other more ethical tools out there. Although I don't know if ethical is the right word when it comes to AI. There are other more transparent tools about how these literature reviews are being generated and things like that, that people can use. And so we talk about those. We talk a lot about Semantic Scholar, and Semantic Scholar being a backend for a lot of tools. So that's like a really good base for us, is to explore Semantic Scholar, explore their publishing agreements, and how they're kind of generating their content, and then looking at what tools use Semantic Scholar as a backend, like Research Rabbit or Connected Papers or Undermine, for instance, are all kind of using Semantic Scholar in some way or form. And so by kind of grounding the conversation that way, it's been really helpful in kind of getting people away from ChatGPT as a lit review tool, or at least understanding how to better critically evaluate what's coming out of ChatGPT. So those are some of the tools that we go over in that particular session. And then Sandy, of course, has other examples from the law field.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned that we teach how to use ChatGPT for your law degree workshop, which is really our sneaky way of showing them how not to use it. Because we've all seen examples of like lawyers who used it to find case law and it made up so much stuff. So we kind of, try to recommend uses that are a bit safer. Law databases are actually really keen to adopt AI or generative AI components. So we have Lexis Plus AI, which I think is already available in the US, but will be in Canada in the winter. So we're kind of preparing our response to that specific tool. That being said, like at McGill Copilot, like Microsoft Copilot, their Gen AI is the one that is vetted by the university. So we show tools, but we cannot tell people to use them. So that's up to them. But yeah, there is more to come, definitely.
All right, cool. This is one from Kira that kind of ties in a bit. Have you implemented the framework at your institution so far, or how have you implemented it so far? Is it something that you have faculty buy-in for?
we don't necessarily have faculty buy-in yet. It kind of came out in the fall, so I think we're kind of building up to that. I'm hoping as we kind of prepare our response to that Lexis plus AI and those databases in law, that we can kind of use it, you know, as a case, like as a case to test it out, for example. But in my experience, at least anytime I've talked about the framework with faculty, I get kind of this glazed look and they don't really get as interested in it as librarians do. So I might not present it as a framework, but more like, here are some of the things we want students to take out of this or learn out of this. So I might just kind of tweak a little bit the messaging and how I present something like that to them. But we've implemented it in the workshop series that Amanda mentioned, which was really kind of our case study for it. And I'm hoping to kind of build up on it for some of the work that we're gonna do. And Amanda wants to add too.
Yeah, well, Sandy had mentioned our AI working group at the library. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing is developing a series of training modules for staff. And this is a really great example for us to take this framework and use it as a tool to actually put these modules into practice and make sure that our colleagues are kind of following similar steps. And yeah, a really good way to kind of implement it in the real world.
Yeah, that's really cool. Here's another question from Jody that's kind of in line with this, with institutional questions. One question that comes up a lot at my university is how to guide students to navigate the mix of AI and non-AI tools for different stages of the research process. In other words, how to choose the tool for the job. Does this fall somewhere in your framework?
Yes, it does. I think we do have one that talks about like appropriate use of
Experimenting with
AI.
AI tools. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
So experimenting with AI tools, this is a great opportunity for us to kind of play around with these, to critically engage with them, potentially to critically make AI tools as well. It's a really open kind of space where you can kind of get to know what a tool is, how it works, and how it might be used for you. And really the point of this is to consciously engage with it, to make sure that you're an active agent in that process. Because I'm sure we can all agree that there's a lot of AI happening just in the background of our lives that we're kind of engaging with, but we're not really interacting with it in that conscious kind of way. So this way you're an active participant in the conversation and you're being critical about what you're doing. And so that's kind of where we've implemented that in the frame, and something that we encourage our students and our faculty to do as well when we talk to them about AI tools.
Yeah.
All right. To wrap things up, a final question from Harvey. What training materials, workshops, or projects would you suggest to help librarians develop skills as AI practitioners?
Yeah, Sandy and I, we love the Elements of AI online course. This is where we kind of got started, was with Elements of AI. So I really highly recommend it, especially if you're new to the AI space and you're looking to kind of bring yourself up to speed with like foundational knowledge and key terminology. It's really invaluable, this resource. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, and I would also say we just launched in partnership with Concordia University, and we contributed to it a series of 9 modules on AI. They are mostly intended for faculty, but anyone can take them, and librarians will find them super relevant. They take a couple minutes to complete each. They are also on a CC BY license, so you could actually package of modules and put them on your library website if you want. So I'll share the link in the chat, and they're really intended as foundational. Like, I don't know anything about Gen AI and LLM and all the words they were saying today. I just want to kind of get started so I feel more comfortable, like having that kind of basic knowledge of AI, that first frame. It's a really good place to start too. So I'll happily share that in the chat as well.
All right, well, cool. Well, thank you so much to both of you for taking your time to speak with us today and for answering so many questions. And thank you for our audience for your engagement and your questions and comments. We've had a really good discussion, so thank you. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and LTI with the link to the recording and where to access the slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again for all of you out there for joining us today. We hope you found this session informative and engaging, and we hope to see you again soon for another webinar. Take care.